Okay. Hello. Okay, so welcome to the second ChemHIST talks. This is a reprise of two papers from the last national meeting. The first speaker today is Seth Rasmussen from the university, well, I'm saying that wrong, from North Dakota State University in Fargo, North Dakota, where he's been a professor of chemistry for the last 25 years. His chemical research interests are focused on the synthesis and characterization of novel conjugated organic materials. Seth also has a strong interest in the history of chemistry. He's an expert in the history of glass and the history of conjugated polymers. He's also contributed a lot of his time to the HIST division, serving as program chair in that 6-year rotation of chair-elect, chair, and past chair. And he also has contributed many talks and organized many symposia. The title of his talk today is Art and Inspiration, Edouard Benedictus and the Invention of Laminated Safety Glass. So take it away, Seth.
Okay, thank you, Vera. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about this gentleman right here. This is Edouard Benedictus. He's been described using a number of different indicators, but what he's best known for is he's the recognized inventor of laminated safety glass. And he also was considered a master of the Art Deco style, and so both a scientist and an artist. Considering his accomplishments, very little is actually known about him, however. Of the available sources, most of these primarily focus on the fortuitous laboratory accident that served as the inspiration for his invention of laminated safety glass. In terms of first-person accounts, this is really limited to a single account of his invention of laminated safety glass, again focusing primarily on the laboratory accident, and this was given shortly before his death in 1930. This account consists of 4 handwritten pages, and this is preserved in archives in France. And a version of this account was also published in this journal, Glacis et Verus. Although this too is not easy to come by, the journal, of course, is long out of print. Still, accounts of both the accident and the invention of laminated safety glass can be found in a wide variety of sources, often based upon secondary or tertiary sources of some sort. As a result, however, these accounts generally contain various errors and fabricated additions based upon assumptions by the authors, resulting in commonly told stories that are really more myth and legend rather than historical accounts. And so I always like to say that pretty much everything you can find out there by or about him is either myth, legend, or outright misinformation. And so the goal of the current talk is an attempt to separate this misinformation from verifiable facts to present a more valid historical account of both his life and his invention of laminated safety glass. So let's start with talking about his family. So according to Edouard, the Benedictus family name originated from his ancestor, the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Spinoza was more commonly known by his Latinized pen name, Benedictus di Spinoza. And according to Edouard, his descendants then adopted Benedictus as their surname, and that's where the name came from. The problem with this story, however, is that Spinoza never married and is said to have died without any children. At the time of his death, the only remaining family he had was a half-brother, Gabriel, a half-sister, Rebecca, and his nephew, Daniel. As such, it's highly doubtful that Edouard's family were actually descendants of Spinoza. As with Spinoza, however, the family did originate from the Jewish community in Amsterdam. His father was Hermanus Benedictus of Amsterdam, a diamond broker and commodity agent. He later then moved to Paris, where he eventually married his first cousin, Sophie Benedictus, also of Amsterdam, on August 16th, 1877. Edouard then was born in Paris a little over 10 months later on June 29th, 1878. Among his extended family was also his paternal uncle, Edouard Benedictus, and his maternal uncle, Louis Benedictus, the latter of which was also a noted French pianist and composer. So it should be noticed that one or one of the first bits of misinformation that you can find is that a lot of sources confuse Edouard with Edard. It's only one letter difference, while others mistakenly give Lewis as Edouard's brother rather than his uncle. And so these are some of the types of things that you'll see in sources. Moving on to his education, according to Edouard, his early education was overseen by the French poet and Oriental scholar Judith Gautier, daughter of the more famous writer, and then sometimes incorrectly stated to be his aunt. Gautier was in fact only ever married to the poet Mendes. At the same time, however, it's thought that she had relationships with a number of noted men, both during and after her marriage. This included people like Victor Hugo, Richard Wagner, and related to our story here, Edouard's uncle Louis. In terms of Louis Benedictus, she was his frequent and longtime companion, and thus it's quite possible that Edouard did view her as something like an aunt, although they actually never married and she was never formally part of the family. He states that he was initially attracted to music, likely due to the influence of his uncle Louis. Gautier, however, diverted him from this path as she did not view it as a very profitable future. Instead, she encouraged him to study the sciences. As a result, he left for Germany, where he attended the Technische Hochschule Darmstadt, now the Technical University of Darmstadt. At the time, a recognized leader in engineering that had just recently introduced cellulose chemistry as a new discipline. And that becomes important with the type of chemistry that he was looking at later in his career. There he took courses in chemistry, and according to him, the subject interested him, and he quickly understood that what it offered a curious mind. However, it's unknown if he actually ever was awarded a particular degree or exactly what chemistry courses he took while he was at Darmstadt. Upon his return to Paris, somewhere around 1900, he set up a modest private laboratory. He states that his friends were surprised that he didn't use his engineering knowledge to secure a more lucrative career. However, he states he was keen to maintain his independence in order to devote himself to scientific research. At the same time, other than some of the patents that I'll talk about, as far as I can tell, he never actually published even one scientific paper in his career. Okay, so let's talk about the accident. This is what is most commonly found in most sources. By far the most commonly told event related to the invention of laminated safety glass. And in general, this involved a broken glass object held together by some type of organic coating. The details, however, vary from source to source. And so, for example, the location is sometimes given as a laboratory, sometimes it's his studio, his shop, or just not stated. The glass object varies from a flask to a beaker to a bottle to a jar. And then the contents of that glass object are given as cellulose nitrate liquid plastic, cellulose nitrate a liquid plastic, or just a liquid that evaporated to give a plastic film. And so here is a slide from Open University, which is a part of Britannica. And so there's a YouTube video all about this accident online. And you can see here, Edouard is holding essentially a jar. And so that's kind of the types of depictions of this accident that you'll find. So what exactly happened? So according to Benedictus, this is his personal account, he says, as I was tidying up my physical chemistry laboratory in 1903 and changing the jars, a bottle slipped from my hands and fell to the floor from the full height of the room. This was about 3.5 meters or about 11.5 feet. This bottle, with a capacity of about 1 liter, I found intact in appearance, starred internally like a Bohemian crystal, but very solid in all its parts due to an energetic internal support. And so that's essentially the account. Now, one point that is very interesting in almost all retellings of the story, it's emphasized that Benedictus was standing on a ladder when all of this happened. Benedictus's account says nothing at all about a ladder. And this seems to be something that has been inserted into the account based upon this statement that I have highlighted here, that this fell from the full height of the room, essentially about 11.5 feet. However, if you look at a laboratory of this time period, and so this is an example. So here's the types of shelves he was working on that go all the way to the ceiling. This could be accessed from a ladder, but for a lot of us that work in chemistry labs, we don't use ladders. you need to get something a little higher, you use a stool. And so you can see there's no ladder shown here anywhere here, but there's plenty of stools. And that would definitely allow easy access to that top shelf. And this would also more account for why he dropped it, because he would have been straining at the very end of his reach to get to that bottle. Probably the most misrepresented and misunderstood aspect of the event was the contents of the bottle. Again, he outlines exactly what was in the bottle. He said that it originally contained the following mixture. This is a combination of alcohol and ether, a little bit of acetone, a little bit of amyl acetate, and some trinitrocellulose. So these types of ether or ether alcohol solutions of cellulose nitrate were known as glutathione and date back to about 1846. And so this was used for the production of coatings and lacquers, including use as coatings for wounds and cuts. The purpose in his lab, however, is unknown. He never states what he was using it for, and it's not clear what he might have had it in his lab for. And its use as a medical coating, it's the basis of the modern product Nu Skin. You can actually go out and buy this, which is this pretty much the same exact solution with a little bit of antiseptic added to it to help the healing of the wounds. So according to Benedictus, the bottle was 15 years old, during which the solvents had evaporated to give, as he states, a layer of highly tenacious cellulotic enamel. Statements in some sources that this layer was the plastic celluloid, however, are technically incorrect. While related, celluloid refers to a specific plastic comprised of cellulose trinitrate and the plasticizer camphor. Nevertheless, it was this organic coating that held the broken bottle together after hitting the floor. The other thing I should point out is, obviously, since this bottle was 15 years old, this predates his time setting up the lab. So he must have gotten this bottle secondhand somehow. And the fact that it had evaporated over this time also points to the fact that this was not a reagent that he used very commonly in the lab. After considering the bottle for a time, he put the following label on it. He said, November 1903, this bottle fell from a height of 3.50 meters and was recovered by me in the state in which it is currently. He then placed the bottle back on the shelf and, as he states, thought no more of it until his attention was drawn to 2 accidents caused by broken glass in cars. Exactly when this occurred, however, is unknown, and he doesn't state even a year as to when these accidents occurred. The first of these accidents involved a young woman in a taxi who had her throat cut by shards of window glass following a crash. A few weeks later, a second accident caused serious cuts to the throats of another young woman. I've actually tried to track down to see if I could find accounts of either of these, and so far I've been unsuccessful. So he states that he was in deep reflection of these accidents when the image of his broken bottle suddenly came to his mind. Rousing himself, he entered his laboratory in order to consider the possibilities. And according to him, he remained there until the next dawn, at which point he found he'd not moved for 9 hours, bottle still in hand. In the process, however, he got some ideas and developed a plan. So the next evening, he used a copying press to prepare a prototype of what ended up being his new laminated glass. And so this was comprised of 2 sheets of glass with a celluloid core. So now we're actually talking the plastic celluloid was used in between these two, and then this was put under pressure and heat to comprise this into a laminated structure. He then filed his first French patent on August 10th, 1909, which the English translation would be glass reinforced by interposition of a celluloid core. This original 1909 patent specified that the sheet of celluloid could be coated with a suitable solvent. He points out acetone as an example, after which it's inserted between the 2 sheets of glass and the layered assembly is subjected to pressure. He specifies that a hydraulic press should be used in order to provide enough pressure for this process. This was then followed by a 1910 patent that described the use of vacuum to bond the layers rather than pressure. The advantage here was that this could more effectively be applied to curved or bent glass. He then also filed international patents in 1910 in England, Germany, and here in the US. The following year, in 1911, he founded the Society de Vera Triplex, whose purpose was to study exploit and license his various patents. The name Triplex glass, which is what he used to refer to this laminated glass, is a reference to the 3 layers of the laminated glass. Another 1912 patent then followed, which detailed the use of gelatin or a gelatin cellular core for the laminated glass. So while the society did manufacture small amounts of safety glass, it primarily sold licenses for its patents abroad. And so the first of these was sold to Delpak in England, who founded the English Triplex Safety Glass Company in 1912 and then started production of Triplex glass the following year in 1913. At this point, the manufacture of Triplex glass most commonly involved the following process. So a thin glass of about 2.5 millimeter was cleaned and coated with a layer of gelatin, about 10 microns, which was then carefully dried. A sheet of celluloid previously immersed in alcohol was then placed between the 2 panes of glass, and the assembly is subjected to a pressure of up to about 10 kilograms with heating. In certain productions, additional plasticizers and or primers were also added to the 2 sides to be laminated. So the production cost of Triplex glass was a limitation, and as a result, there was really not a significant market for it prior to World War I. So measured either by performance or cost, the glass was initially not deemed acceptable. Still, the increased safety and durability was considered desirable for the war effort. And so as a result, it was really during the war that the manufacture of Triplex glass was established as a significant industry. And so during this period, there was a demand for Triplex glass in applications to both airplane and automobile windshields, bulletproof glass for tanks, glass for submarines, battleship bridge windows, lenses for gas masks, and particularly aviators' goggles. And that's the image I'm showing you here, as well as other types of appliances for military combat. Of course, after the war, demand for Triplex glass then fell off, and the industry languished for a bit without the previous demand that it had seen during World War I. Still, the automobile industry offered the most promise for future development. And by 1919, Triplex found application as automotive windshields in England. And so this is one of their ad sheets for Triplex glass for automobiles in England at that time. In the US, Amory Haskell was impressed by the life protective value of the glass, which led to the incorporation of the Triplex Safety Glass Company of North America under license from the English Triplex Safety Glass Company, who in 1923 had secured the world rights of Triplex glass from the Société de Verre Triplex. With the rise of closed automobiles during the 1920s, interest in safer automobile glass also was on the rise, and so this drove an interest in Triplex glass. And then a landmark moment was in December of 1924. Ford introduced the Model A, which came standard with safety glass. And so this was the first model of any automobile producer to come standard with this type of safety glass. The glass was supplied by Libby Owens, which was the first company in the US to produce automotive safety glass. However, as far as I can tell, this was not done under the Triplex license. And so it seems like they had their own version of Triplex glass that somehow skirted the Triplex patents. However, Libby Owens merged with the Edward Ford Plate Glass Company in 1930, becoming the Libby Owens Ford Glass Company, which then took over control of the Triplex Safety Glass Company of North America in 1931, at which point they also got control of the licenses in the US for Triplex glass. And so at that point, they did have the Triplex licenses. But as far as I can tell, from that 1927 to 1931, they did not have any licensing of the Triplex. By the end of 1930, the United States was the leading producer of laminated glass. At this time, it was estimated that almost 5 million cars in the US were equipped with safety glass for at least the front windshield. And then in 1932, the use of Triplex was made compulsory for automobile windshields in England. And so at this point, it became a mainstay of automobile production and still is used in automobiles today. So lastly, I just kind of want to wrap up a little bit talking about Benedictus the artist. It's unknown exactly when he started to work in the arts. However, looking at the details of his 1914 U.S. patent, which was filed in 1910, he lists his profession there as artistic painter. And this is the only one of his patents where he makes this statement. It's been stated that after World War I, so post 1919, he abandoned science to devote himself to the arts. Part of this may have been that during World War I, while Triplex glass was being used extensively, he really had no role in that because he had just licensed his patents out. However, he did work for the War Office in France during World War I, where in particular, he worked on new gases being used in chemical warfare. And so this might have soured him a little bit on the sciences during that time period as well. Already a designer and critic of the Art Nouveau era, he found his stride with the advent of Art Deco, designing color palettes and geometric flower motifs that earned him commissions from leading European design firms. And so this is some of his work here that was published in the first of his portfolios. And so this was Variations that was published in 1923. This was followed by a second portfolio, Nouvelles Variations or New Variations in 1928. After which he became one of the most famous protagonists of floral Art Deco design. He was invited to participate as a representative of Art Deco textile design in the 1925 exposition des Arts Décoratifs in Paris. And so this was quite a big deal. The central salon actually had both rugs and fabrics that he designed as a part of that exposition. And then in 1928, he was listed as a member of the Society of Decorative Artists, both as a painter and decorator, particularly in terms of furniture, fabrics, carpets, prints on paper and fabric, things like that. And then unknowingly, or exactly what happened at the height of his career, he then died on January 28th, 1930. So he was only age 51. I found absolutely no reference whatsoever as to what he died from. All that I know is he died in his home. And interestingly, he died only about a week after he married his second wife. And so we can think of what might have happened there, but as far as I can tell, there was nothing suspicious about his death. But it was quite sudden and quite surprising to his friends and followers. With that, I will stop. A few quick acknowledgments. Of course, HIST, who has supported my work in history for the last 30-some years now. I have to acknowledge BBC Studios. This actually started, they contacted me asking me to consult on this topic because they wanted to include it in one of their programs and they were not convinced about the validity of some of the sources they were looking at. And so I was able to quickly point out several things that they should avoid saying. But it interested me so much that ended up kind of moving into this project that I presented today. And then lastly, both the students in my research group and my department that allows me to do history, although it doesn't bring in the big grants like normal chemical research does. And then various bits of support as well over the years. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions I possibly can.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, you can, I think Anna wants them put in the chat. Is that what you want to do, Anna?
Either way is fine. The group is small enough, so if people want to unmute themselves, I don't see a problem.
I have a question, Seth. So is the
Sure.
Wikipedia article, has it been updated to include your information?
No, no, there's a number of places on the web that I like to send information to. I've kind of been waiting until hopefully the paper will be published soon, and then I'll just send them a copy of my paper and point that things need to be updated.
Okay.
I'm surprised though. So, I mean, information on both sides, both the science side and the art side, is often incorrect, and there's very little information out there. So, part of the problem, again, going back to the original documents, anything that is of merit that actually has useful information is only available in French. And
Yeah.
so that does provide a barrier to some people as well.
Well, some of us exist can speak that language. My question to you is, you mentioned there's no record of him getting a degree or anything.
Yes.
Did you actually? I don't know, because with the war, a lot of records were lost in Europe. If it would be even possible to contact the university.
Yeah, so I've tried looking through university documents, particularly their library. Oftentimes I'm pretty successful at finding dissertations and theses that way.
Yeah.
I haven't found anything. I haven't tried contacting the university yet, though.
Just curious.
Seth, I have a question. Did you try looking for death certificates for him?
So I know there is a death certificate. I have not looked at it to see if it says anything about cause of death.
Right.
So there actually is a researcher in France that has done a pretty good job on his genealogy. And so she actually has links to all of the original documents to support all of her dates and claims. And so some of those, though, considering the dates we're talking about, and they're in French, but the handwriting is atrocious. And I can't even read what they're trying to state. And of course, my French is pretty rudimentary anyway, so.
Right.
There any other questions, comments? All right, I think we should thank Seth very much for his talk. He can unshare his screen and Alice can get her set up. So I'd like to introduce Alice Haddy. She is a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, excuse me, where she's been for the last 30 years. The main courses she teaches are physical chemistry for the life sciences and a general education course in the energy use. Her traditional research has been on photosystem 2, the light-absorbing protein complex in higher plants that produces oxygen, particularly using electron paramagnetic resonance spectroscopy and kinetic methods. More recently, she's developed research projects in science history, including one on early synthetic analgesic drugs used in medicines during the late 19th and early 20th century. The name of her talk today is Drug Analysis in the Early Years of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Take it away, Alice.
Thank you, Vera. Yes, so my interest in the early drug use has led me to looking at the basically what happened in 1906 in terms of regulation. And so let's see here. Yeah, so what I'd like to tell you about is the early drug enforcement that was a result of the very first Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, and in particular, what was happening with drug regulations. So what were the drugs of interest in the act? How were analyses done? And I'm going to use acid analyte as a particular example. And what early court cases were important for enforcement of the law in the first few years. So the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, it was really the very first federal law regulating food and drug quality. Before then, there was really nothing that would regulate drugs for the consumer or food. And it was ushered in by Harvey Wiley. He's shown over here on the side. He was the first head of the Bureau of Chemistry in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And he was an expert in food adulteration. He worked with legislators for quite a long time to make this law happen. And basically, it did not seem like a very strong law under today's standards, but it was the very first one that would prohibit misbranding or adulteration of food and drugs. And in the case of drugs, it required the display of certain drugs on the label for the very first time. And before this time, there were a lot of patent medicine remedies, for example, out there that really had no requirement to show what was in the contents at all. So this is the list of drugs that had to be on the label. There's really only about 10 or 11 of them. And they were mostly drugs of concern that would be used in patent medicine formulas. So in addition to alcohol, some of these would look familiar as narcotics that we know today: morphine, opium, cocaine, and heroin. But also of interest were acid analyte and any derivative. So acid analyte was a very early antipyretic analgesic drug that actually had some dangerous properties to it and was widely used in patent medicines. And the law also sort of was broadened a bit by having this any derivative clause as part of it. The law also specified how drugs would be characterized and analyzed, and in particular, it specified the association of official agricultural chemists' methods in determining what was present. So as far as drugs go for this law, that was under the enforcement of the Drug Division of the Bureau of Chemistry. And this was headed by Lyman Kebler, who's shown over here on the right. He was hired in 1903 as the director of the drug lab. So Harvey Wiley was an expert in food adulteration. Lyman Kebler was an expert in drug adulteration. He'd been a chief chemist at SmithKline and French Company when he joined the Bureau. Soon after that, the drug lab was made into a drug division in 1908, and it was split into 4 labs: the drug inspection lab, synthetic products lab, essential oils lab, and pharmacology lab. And this is a picture of the Bureau of Chemistry building in 1910, shown on the left. So the drug division had several important activities that it needed to carry out to enforce the new law. And one of these was method development. So this was actually important for both the food and drug side. At that time, the analytical methods and the chemical reagents alike were not very well standardized. So Harvey Wiley and Lyman Kebler worked very closely with the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists in order to develop standard methods that could be reliably used from lab to lab throughout the United States and other places as well. So after Lyman Kebler was hired, one of the first things he worked on was standardizing the analysis of morphine, and then soon after that, other alkaloids from other various sources. A second important activity of the drug division was in working with companies to comply with the new law. And they would issue guarantees after they'd worked with a company. The guarantee would basically state that, yes, what's on the label is what's in the product. And these would be displayed on the labels of products. And then, of course, another important activity was the actual detection of adulteration in drugs. So the drug inspection lab, for example, between 1909 and 1910, they analyzed 900 interstate and 1,200 imported drug samples that had been accumulated. And they actually made 150 recommendations for prosecution, but most of these did not go forward. Similarly, the synthetic products lab analyzed 800 brands of headache and cold remedies between 1907 and 1910. And it does seem like headache and cold remedies were a pretty big focus of the early activities in the first few years of the law. So this is a page from a fairly well-known, it was like, I think, one of the very first forensic chemistry books that was published by Alfred Lucas. And this is a table of poisons extracted with solvents. It shows 10 different poisons. So poisons forensically would be of interest, of course, because of accidental or intentional poisonings. So this list would not be the same as what was of interest in the Food and Drug Act, where we were more concerned with labeling properly for the consumer, but there is some overlap. And so in particular, morphine and cocaine were of interest both forensically and for the Pure Food and Drug Act, and also acid analyte and phenacetin in the forensic chemistry list is also present. And these three drugs here that are circled in red, those are three antipyretic analgesics that were of importance in the patent medicine industry. They were often used in headache and cold remedies. And the last two here are actually sedatives, the sulfonal and the vironal. Vironal is the same thing as barbital. So I'm going to go over one of the analyses that was used for analysis of the patent medicine remedies. This is from the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists, and it is for the analysis of acid analyte. The method is actually from a description of analysis of vanilla and its substitutes. What they were looking for in this particular method was vanillin, coumarin, and acid analyte. So vanillin, of course, would be the flavoring you'd expect in vanilla. Coumarin was a flavoring from tonka beans that was widely used as a substitute, sort of an adulterant. And acid analyte, I'm not sure why that was in vanilla, but apparently in the mid-19th century, it was quite common for that to be an adulterant in commercially available vanilla. So this method it depends on wet chemical techniques. Back in these days, spectroscopy had not been developed well enough to be used to analyze anything. So everything was a wet chemical method. So a lot of this method in particular has to do with the separation of the three chemicals. And so the acid analyte in particular was isolated using an ether extraction. And then after that, once you get your solid acid analyte, you would weigh it and determine its amount gravimetrically. And after that, you would confirm its identity by taking the melting point and doing wet chemical tests. The melting point was expected to be around 112, which was a little lower than its actual melting point. This is the page from the manual that actually describes it. And by the way, the method in the official and provisional methods of analysis, notice that this book was actually edited by Harvey Wiley, and that's how closely he had worked with the Association of Official Agricultural Chemists. But this is just the part of it that's for the detection of acid analyte. And so I'm going to go through it with my updated interpretation of what was going on in these tests. The determination or the confirmation that your product was acid analyte was done by first boiling some of it in HCl, concentrated HCl, for 2 or 3 minutes, and that would produce aniline from the acid analyte, which starts here. You'd separate this then into 3 parts. To the first part, you add chlorinated lime, which is calcium hypochlorite, and this would ultimately produce an indophenol. You had to do it carefully so that you'd have 2 layers, and the beautiful blue would form at the junction between the 2 layers. To the second fraction, you would add potassium permanganate, and this would produce polyaniline, which had a clear green color. And finally, to the third fraction, you would add chromic acid solution and thereby produce sort of a yellowish green, which would become green. And I think what's happening there is it's forming benzoquinone first, and which was then partially converted to hydroquinone. And the complex of benzoquinone and hydroquinone is then the darker green color, maybe known as quinhydrone. So now you have your acid analyte confirmed. You know what it is. I'll say a little bit more about the indophenol test. This was the first of those three tests. It's actually a test that was very widely used to identify acid analyte and its cousins, phenacetin and acetaminophen, which is, of course, Tylenol we know today. So these three drugs are very similar chemically. The acid analyte and the phenacetin were dropped from use during the later mid to late 20th century. But of course, we're still using Tylenol today because that's the actual analgesic form. So you can convert all three of these to para-aminophenol using boiling HCl, and maybe you'd need some hypochlorite for the first two. But then reacting with the hypochlorite and phenol, you can actually produce quantitatively the indophenol, which later in the 20th century was used to determine the amount of paraphenol or, Tylenol, whatever it came from, quantitatively. This actually had originally come from a test to determine ammonia from the mid-1800s. And it's Berthelot's reaction, which using a solution of phenol and hypochlorite will produce that indophenol blue compound. Well, acid analyte and phenacetin were frequently found in mixture because they were used together in these patent medicine formulas quite a bit. Acid analyte was the cheaper but more dangerous version, but phenacetin was a little bit safer, but it was patented by Bayer Pharmaceuticals, so it was more expensive and a little harder to get, perhaps. And they're very similar drugs, so it was difficult to differentiate between them. They did have different melting points. So, of course, you could take your solid and see what its melting point was and decide whether it was probably a mixture. So that was to be the first thing you would do. But there were quite a few methods for separating the two also. And this one here was published in 1914. It's one by W.O. Emery, who was the chief of the synthetic products lab in the drug division. And in this particular method, you precipitated phenacetin as periodide and effectively separated the two that way. And it was apparently a fairly successful method. And the article, if you look at it, it has exhaustive variations of various runs that they did with different amounts of acetic acid, HCl, and iodine. But I think they were pretty pleased with their result in the end. Well, I wanted to tell you about a few of the court cases that were early in the drug law and sort of established its usefulness. The first of these is called United States versus Harper. And this is because of a product called Cue for Headache Brain Food. This was the very first test of the Pure Food and Drug Act. And it was brought in 1908 in police court in Washington, D.C. I think this was a convenient location because that's where this product was actually manufactured. The product contained acid analyte, antipyrin, that's one of the other analgesics, caffeine, sodium and potassium bromide, which were sedatives, and alcohol, of course. So the complaint against Harper was that Cue for Headache Brain Food was advertised in a false and misleading way. And also that the key ingredients were not well specified, claims about its effects, and the name itself was problematic. And this trial did actually include some testimony about the effects of acid analyte. In the end, the Brain Food Company was found guilty, mainly based on the Brain Food brand. And Robert Harper ended up having to pay about $700, which is over $20,000 in today's money. The second one I'd like to talk about is called United States versus 100, more or less, packages of anti-camnia tablets. And this is anti-camnia shown over here on the right. Anti-camnia was a drug, an analgesic, antipyretic, that was originally sold as a new product, but it was in fact the very same thing as acid analyte originally. But as the 1906 law was coming forward, the makers of anti-camnia decided to replace the acid analyte with phenacetin because they were hoping they would not have to then label the product. They wouldn't have to put phenacetin on the label, but they would have to put acid analyte on the label. So the question here was whether phenacetin really was considered a derivative of acid analyte. And we, of course, know that they're not the same drug, but I think the idea more was what was the Bureau capable of doing in terms of regulation. So initially, when the court case was brought in 1910, the ruling was in favor of anti-camnia, that acid analyte is not the same thing as phenacetin. And so there's no acid analyte in anti-camnia. You don't have to label it. But it was appealed and eventually made it to the Supreme Court. And the ruling was in favor of the government in the end. And this is actually impresses me as being a somewhat important ruling, because the idea here is that the government agencies should have the authority to make regulations to carry out the provisions of the law. And so there was a law, which was actually sort of short. It was a 7-page law, but the Bureau had published a guide to how the law was to be carried out later in 1906. And that's where they had stated that phenacetin was going to be considered a derivative of acid analyte. And so the idea here is that, yeah, they should be able to carry out the law as they interpret it in their expertise. So finally, the last one I'll tell you about is the United States versus 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola. The complaint here was against the product Coca-Cola, which was actually more of a food product rather than a drug product. However, the issue at hand had a lot to do with the caffeine added to Coca-Cola. So although caffeine was not one of the 10 or so drugs that were named in the law that had to be on the label, the problem was that caffeine was an additive that was basically going unregulated. And people in the Bureau, like Wiley and Kebler, had a lot of concerns about this, the caffeine content, which was often drunk by children who were quite small. They also thought there was shoddy manufacturing practices, and that the drink was actually misbranded because the name Coca-Cola implies that there's coca leaf and cola nut, and neither of those were present. In fact, Coca-Cola, which is well known to have had cocaine in it at one time, the cocaine had been dropped from the formulation before the law went into effect. And at the same time, they had increased the caffeine content quite a bit. And I think this was part of the reason why it was such a focus of concern. So at first, this went to trial in 1911, and it was suddenly dismissed on the basis that caffeine was not actually an additive, but a basic part of the drink. So if you think about that a little bit, we're saying that an additive is actually a food as a result of this ruling. So there were appeals of this, of course, and eventually it went to the Supreme Court, and they did end up ruling in favor of the government. In particular, there was misbranding because it did not actually contain coca leaf or cola nut. And it was adulterated because the caffeine content was injuriously high. Now, I will say that by today's standards, I would say the caffeine content was probably not that frighteningly high, considering how much we drink now. But at that time, I think the effects of caffeine were not very well understood, and it was a valid concern. So as part of the settlement, one interesting thing is that they did reduce the caffeine content in Coca-Cola, and they started to use spent coca leaves in the manufacture of it, which is coca leaves from which the cocaine has been extracted. So I will say that I think this court case was really hard on the Bureau. I think having to appeal it this many times, and they received a lot of criticism from within the administration and from outside. And I think it was very difficult for them at the time. All right, so I hope to have told you a little bit about what was going on in the first few years in terms of drug regulation after the 1906 law was passed, and the duties of the drug division in the Bureau of Chemistry, in particular in strengthening our standards of reagent quality and assays, and working with companies so that they could comply with the new law, and in analyzing patent medicines and other products. And they actually published quite a few of these results. So thank you for your attention. And I will be happy to answer any questions. And yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice. Does anybody have, I would note that Dan Ravinovich put a first day cover in the chat for those of you who want to take a look at that on the 50th anniversary of the Pure Food and Drug Act with a stamp honoring Dr. Wiley. So
All right, yeah.
you see.
Yeah.
So it seems to me, Alice, that one of the cases that you talked about with the result was the fact that the Supreme Court said that a law is made, and if a unit is set up, such as the drug analysis units and things of that nature, that they have the right to basically write regulations to carry out the law. That became the general way that all these agencies that were set up, like the Environmental Protection Agency, that carries through from there. And that's kind of a point of contention right now.
Yeah, I don't know anything about, following Supreme Court cases that may have been similar, but yeah, I was very struck by that this was, it is a pretty short law, and you have to, not all the details are there. So somebody's got to fill in the details. And apparently the Supreme Court understood that at the time. And putting in that phrase, any derivative, it does really broaden the law. There's a potential for broadening that, is then left up to the judgment of those who are enforcing it, I think.
There was another version of it, right? I mean, in the 20s or 30s?
Oh, of the law?
So Drug Act.
Yeah, so this was the main law until the late 1930s. So it was in 1938, I think it's called the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. That was a major change. So it completely replaced the Pure Food and Drug Act, and really established the kinds of regulation we have today. For example, at that point, all contents were required to be on the label, and it also authorized the assessment of drugs, and which was not a part of the 1906 law at all. Yeah, the efficacy was not a thing in the first law. Just labeling. I mean, that was a big step. Get it on the label.
Does anybody have questions for Alice?
Yeah, there's a question in the chat box. Eunice Ross asks if the Bureau ever used animal testing.
Oh, so the Bureau of Chemistry at that time, Not that I'm aware of. I'm not an expert on what they were doing at the food end. And my research so far hasn't gotten very far past the 1920s at the drug end. But yeah, so that's something that I think would have then come forward once the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act of 1938 was put in place, because then there was the authorization to do actual assessment of drugs at that time. So, yeah, just my guess.
There's another question in the chat by Patrick Charbonneau. How constrained was the formulation of the 1906 law by the capabilities of analytical chemistry at the time?
Oh, yeah. So I think there's a good chance that a lot of what they were looking for was what they could look for. So the constraints, the abilities were all, wet chemical at the time. And that's a very time-intensive sort of endeavor, which is why I'm so impressed that they did anything in the neighborhood of a couple thousand, analyses. Yeah, so it is food for thought there. How much good they really do.
I have one of your sources was the book The Poison Squad by Deborah Blum.
Yeah.
Read that, and if anybody's interested in the early days of the FDA, that's an excellent book, well written and
Yeah.
full of facts.
Yeah, that's a great book.
Deborah did a webinar with ACS within the last year or so, and it's probably available to ACS members online. And I was just thinking of that as the Poison Squad were animal studies in a particular animals.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. I'd forgotten that. So that's at the food end of things, technically, but yeah, he wanted to know about those additives. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So animal testing was done on people. Oh.
Any other questions or comments for Alice? Now, in that case, I want to thank both our speakers. They did a great job at the meeting. They've done another great job at this webinar. I also just want to advertise a little bit by saying that Seth's talk was part of the general papers at the fall meeting. Alice's was part of a symposium called Solving Mysteries with Chemistry, History of Forensic Chemistry. And I encourage anybody, that's listening in, if you have a passion that involves the history of chemistry, we'd be happy to receive an abstract for your paper. So I thank everybody for being here today, and we'll hope to bring you another set of talks in the spring.
Abstracts for San Diego are due Monday, I think.
Exactly. That's there's still time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks. So thank everybody for being here, and we'll get it posted, the recording posted onto the HIST website by early next week. Let's just say that. It takes sometimes a little bit of time for the software to chew through and make the recording. Okay. Goodbye, everybody. Once again.
Thanks, Vera, Anna.
Hi. Hi, Dan.